Is it possible for us to turn this into this? Yeah, actually. Every sound in this track was made using only sounds from that bird call competition video. Even the drums. We see a lot of talk online about how limitations breed creativity. And for the most part, this is true. By limiting the set of tools that we have access to, we force ourselves to think more outside the box with the tools that we do have. So I'm going to walk you through this track and show you how I was able to make all of these different sounds from a single video. So I'll start by talking about how I made this synth tone right here. What I did was I found just a single bit of the original sample that I liked, that sound right there, and then I just pitched it down. And then I loaded that sound into a sampler, and then in the sampler I found a single cycle of the waveform that I liked. And then I chose the looping sustain mode, forward 2 arrows. That just means that it will play the section of the sample that you select and then play it again and again and again and so on. And this effectively becomes an oscillator that we can use to design a synth patch. So then I shaped the volume envelope, as you can see here, gave it kind of a long release, decently short decay and a mid-level sustain, so it still has like a percussive attack, but a longer release. I didn't touch the filter at all, but then on the pitch envelope page, I did give it a pitch envelope with a pretty short decay. But I attached this device Proby that I've talked about a few times. It spits out random values every time you trigger a MIDI note, so I just attached that to the pitch envelope amount, and then every time the MIDI note triggers, we get a slightly different amount of pitch envelope. I then ran it through Valhalla Room. On these settings, I ran it through Roar. So let me show it without Roar. It's quite clean. Roar just gives it like ever so slight bit of saturation, and then some delay, and that's pretty much it. It's a pretty simple sound. This one, it kind of sounds like a shaker, but it's actually... I just took a section of that, I sped it up a little bit so that it matched the tempo. And then I EQ'd quite a bit out of it, and then I ran it through Stab, which is like a multi-band transient shaper kind of thing, just to make it a little bit tighter. And then this sound, which is kind of like a snare, let's hear the original sound. Yeah, so that's the original sound. And then I pitch shifted it up 2 octaves and added EQ8 and erosion, and that's how we got that. This sound... identical to the snare, I just used a different part of the sound that didn't have much going on in it. It looks like it was just noise, and then running through that EQ and erosion kind of makes it sound like a hi-hat. I can't remember exactly what the original source was for that, but all I did was take a small portion of the sample and run it through a very short delay with a high feedback rate, and then I recorded the output of that and reversed it and then turned it into a riser. The bass patch is the exact same as the keys patch that I just talked through in the beginning of the video, but the envelope is a little bit different. It stays at full volume during the duration of the MIDI note, and then at the end of the MIDI note, it has a much faster release. And then that's running through a saturator and erosion. And then I have it running through an EQ to bump the mids during this kind of like breakdown section in the middle of the track. And then this sound is, again, identical patch as before, just copied and pasted. However, all I did was I took this part of the single cycle waveform and just moved one of the loop points at the end ever so slightly so that it got a little bit buzzier. And then I retuned it to make sure it was in key. But the patch is identical. Still running through Valhalla Room, still running through Roar at a slightly different saturation level, echo, and an EQ to kind of thin it out a little bit. Okay, let's take a look at the kick. I used the exact same single cycle waveform as before, put a pitch envelope on it with a pretty sharp decay, and then I put a volume envelope on it with a slight soft attack, like less than a millisecond, a pretty sharp decay, and then ran it through saturation and erosion. And that's what we get. Now for the snare, so the snare drum is actually made up of two different sounds. The first sound is, again, that same single cycle waveform with a pretty sharp envelope, so it's just like a really short percussive sound. It's got a little bit of a pitch envelope so that it bends up when it first starts and then it comes back down, running through a saturator to clip it. And then the second part of the sound is just a bit of noise. So let's see if I turn off these effects here. Yeah, just a bit of noise, pitch shifted up an octave, cut very short, and run through an EQ and a saturator. And then when you combine those together, and then you run them through some additional EQing, some additional saturation, even more EQing. I also ran it through Slap by Mr. Bill, only using the clap, spray, and clip settings. The clap setting kind of gives you like a wash of noise under it, which you can then shape the timbre and the length of it. The spray is a similar thing, and then additional clipping. And then I ran it through that multiband transient shaper, stab again, and that's what it sounds like. And then in context. There's also these, I just called them weird hats. They're not really hats at all, they're just kind of like a weird percussive sound. All I did for this one was I loaded the entire sample into a sampler, and then I set the envelopes really short, did some filtering to cut off some of the lows, and then on the modulation page, using one of the LFOs set to sample and hold mode, I set it to a really high rate, so it's basically random every time, and then linked the LFO to the sample offset. That means every time a note is triggered, it's just going to pick a random part of the sample to play back. Then I gave it some pretty steep pitch envelope, ran it through a saturator, Valhalla Room on a very short reverb tail at about a half mix, and then I ran it through OTT. And that's what we get. I think that's everything going on during that part of the track. Yeah, so then there's this part, which is the same patch as the Weird Hats, just with a different pattern, running through a very short delay and with a pretty aggressive EQ on it to cut out some of the highs. And then it's running through Valhalla Room at the end. And then this sound. Yeah, so that's the Weird Hats running through a echo and resampled. And then at this part, to build back into the drop, I just reversed that sound. And then the second drop is pretty much exactly that, but I layered the Weird Hat resampled with delay. Yeah, so I just recorded the whole Weird Hat channel with a delay on it, resampled it, and cut it down to a 4-bar loop that I could just copy and paste throughout the duration of the second drop. And everything else is more or less exactly the same from the first drop. Yeah, so it's a really simple track. There's not a lot going on. Not a ton of tracks, not a ton of layers. Just very simple use of some simple sounds cut out of this video sample. And that's all there is. So let's go ahead and take a listen to the full track.